I'm joined now by Congressman Jamie Raskin. Congressman, this is the episode that I feel like the internet has been waiting for. If I had $1 for every time that somebody online has said America's not a democracy, it's a republic, I feel like I would own my own space company right now. Which brings us to what I think is the most highly anticipated episode of Class with Jamie Raskin, which is our hugely successful series where the congressman debunks right-wing constitutional fallacies and fever dreams, where today he's going to take on this notion that America isn't a democracy, but a constitutional republic. Congressman, take it away.
Well, Brian, it's great to be with you. I've got to say, I've just returned from the road. I've been campaigning out west. I've been to Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, California. I'm seeing a lot of your fans out there and a lot of fans of our constitutional class together. So I think you have identified an audience for serious constitutional conversation. You tell me that there's a lot of anticipation for this one. In some sense, this is the easiest fallacy of all to debunk because it's simply a rhetorical device or trick. The MAGA Republicans like to say, America is not a democracy, America is a republic, and they think they have struck some kind of knockout blow against everything that we're fighting for in America, and in fact, they've not. A republic is just a representative democracy, okay? A republic is just a democracy that's so big we can't fit everybody into the U.S. House of Representatives. We can't fit everybody into the state legislature or everybody into the school board. So we've delegated decision-making to our representatives who are supposed to use some combination of their own wisdom and insight, the will of the people and what the people want them to do, in order to vindicate the public interest. Now, we began as a slave republic of Christian white male property owners over the age of 21. This is true. But if you look at the whole history and evolution of our Constitution, you will see that we have changed dramatically in the direction of greater democracy. So bear with me for a second, and I'm going to tell you how our slave republic has become something much more like a strong democratic republic, although we clearly have a ways to go, and I'll finish by talking about that. Now look, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution banned slavery in the Civil War period. The 14th Amendment gave us equal protection and due process against the state governments in order to enlarge the meaning of democratic citizenship and participation. The 14th Amendment also established that anybody who's born in the United States is a citizen of the United States and of the state in which he or she is born. The 15th Amendment banned race discrimination in voting and at least theoretically opened up the franchise, the suffrage, so that the former enslaved people could participate. And it did work like that for a while during the Reconstruction period. And then, of course, it was taken away through a series of disenfranchising tactics like the grandfather clause, the poll tax, the literacy test, Ku Klux Klan violence, and other mechanisms for closing off the franchise. And a lot of the rhetoric then, of course, was, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And what they meant by that was there were certain people that the so-called redeemers, the former slave masters and racists in the southern states, didn't want participating. And so they wanted to try to restrict the franchise again. But to be very clear, the 15th Amendment at the constitutional level banned race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment in 1913 then shifted the form of election of United States senators from the legislatures choosing the senators to the people choosing the senators. Another democratic move, like dismantling the race restriction on voting. The 19th Amendment, then in 1920, doubled the franchise in America by giving women the right to participate as voters at every level of government. And of course, a bunch of states had done that before by state law changes or by state constitutional changes. But it was in the 19th Amendment that we nationalized it, and we said that all women could participate in the right to vote after great agitation by the suffragettes, who put that on the national agenda and refused to let go. The 23rd Amendment in 1961 gave people who live in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., the right to participate at least in presidential elections and to have Electoral College votes, although no more Electoral College votes than whatever the smallest state would have. And the D.C. has had, since that time, beginning with the 1964 presidential election, 3 electors cast in every presidential election. And as you know, people in Washington, D.C. remain disenfranchised and locked out of Congress, and yet won the right to vote through that expansion in the 23rd Amendment. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in federal elections, poll taxes being used as a way to exclude people who didn't have wealth, disproportionately African American and racial minorities, but also whites who didn't have the money to pay $1 or $1.50. 2 years later, in 1966, in a case called Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, the Supreme Court struck down poll taxes also in state elections, even though the 24th Amendment on its terms applies only to federal elections. And it was argued vociferously by Virginia that we are not a democracy, we're a republic, and the 24th Amendment applies only to federal elections, which would indicate the intention of the framers of the 24th Amendment to allow poll taxes in state elections. And it was very interesting that Justice Douglas and the majority in the case said, no, the addition of the 24th Amendment interacted with 14th Amendment equal protection to transform the meaning of the Constitution to say that wealth could never be a bar to participation in voting. And so the 24th Amendment and Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections 2 years later in 1966 together abolished poll taxes for people going to the polls to vote. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age in America to 18. So you can see the vast majority of the 17 constitutional amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights have been democratizing amendments. They've been amendments that have moved us much closer to the vision of our last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The whole movement of American democracy in constitutional terms and in terms of historical practice has been towards a much more robust democracy, a much stronger democracy. So when people say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, what they're really saying is we want to retrench. We want to go backwards. We want to turn the clock back. And of course, we are in a titanic struggle today about whether we are actually going to be a strong democracy or not. Some of those struggles are purely at the political and statutory and administrative level. For example, when states across the union took up the invitation of the right-wing court in carving up the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 and began passing voter suppression laws across the country, that wasn't some kind of constitutional compulsion that required them to do that. The state legislatures controlled by the Republicans were trying to make it more difficult for people to register to vote. They were trying to make it more difficult for people to vote by creating photo ID laws, by saying in some states, you cannot use your college student ID, but you can use your hunter's license and so on. All of these are attempts to try to micromanage and gerrymander the electorate instead of just giving all of the qualified people the right to vote in the country. The gerrymandering of our federal and state legislative districts is just like that. That's an attempt to nullify and vaporize the meaning of people's votes. And the Republicans have done it across the country. I just got back from visiting my friend Anderson Clayton, the great new chair of the North Carolina State Party. I think she's only 26 years old, but she's leading a remarkable effort there to defeat the right-wing MAGA and Nazi candidates for public office in North Carolina in 2024. But in any event, that's a state that you could say in some kind of reasonable, objective way is a 50-50 state divided between Democrats and Republicans. I think the Democrats are going to win statewide. We're certainly going to defeat the self-avowed Nazi candidate running for governor on the Republican ticket this time. I believe that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are going to win in North Carolina. But okay, call it a 50-50 state. Well, look what happens in the congressional districting, where we've been gerrymandered into oblivion. We're expecting 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats to come to the U.S. House of Representatives. The state legislature has huge lopsided Republican advantages. Why? When you have a state that's 50% Democrat and 50% Republican, it's because they have been able to gerrymander themselves every 10 years into greater and greater defensive encampments where we cannot overthrow their control of the gerrymandering machinery. A 6th grader could do this. If you give a 6th grader the right computer technology and say, draw me a 50-50 state in a way that the Republicans control the legislature with a supermajority and then can keep carving themselves up into a supermajority so they can then dictate the Republican majority in the House delegation, a 6th grader could do it, which means the Republicans can do it, and they have been doing it to us across the South. It's the same story in Texas. It's the same story in Florida. They are enlarging, amplifying, inflating their own political voice, which is an old trick of the reactionaries in America. I mean, that's the story of the 3/5 compromise. The slave masters said, well, we're not going to allow the enslaved people to vote. We're not going to allow them to run for office, but we want to count them for the purposes of census and reapportionment. Why? To inflate the size and therefore the representation of the Southern vote. And the northern states were saying, wait a second, if you're not allowing these human beings to vote and to participate, they can't run for office. Why should they count at all? They shouldn't count at all. And that's how they arrived at the 3/5 compromise. You know, we had more than a dozen new members of the House of Representatives in that first census and reapportionment in 1800 that went to the slave states to inflate the slave power, again, on the backs of the enslaved people who had no voting participation and no right to run for office, of course. And nonetheless, their very existence helped to build the power of the slave states. And 4 out of our 5 the first presidents were slave masters from Virginia who brought enslaved people with them into the presidency. And the vast majority of the first 10 presidents were also slave masters because of that particular trick. Well, today we've got gerrymandering as the trick, and we're still living with some constitutional mechanisms of anti-democratic exclusion. We're still living with the Electoral College. This is an institution whose practice has meant that we have had 5 popular vote losers in our history, twice in this century alone, in 2000 and 2016. It marginalizes the vast majority of Americans. Everybody knows now that this election is going to come down to a handful of states: Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, the states where we've been going to campaign because we have to do it because that's the system we're in. But it means the vast majority of Americans who live in safe blue states, like California or New York or Massachusetts or Maryland, or safe red states like Alaska or North Dakota or South Dakota, or Idaho, don't see any presidential campaign going on. No offices set up, no visits by the candidates unless it's to come and raid the states for money. We find it hard even to get campaign signs in Maryland sent to us by the National Democratic Campaigns because they're making the strategic and pretty much unassailable decision to save the signs for the swing states. It's going to mean a lot more to put them up in Pennsylvania than it is in Maryland. And so we have to go out and make our own signs, which we've done gladly. But you see the basic dynamic there. Is it because, Nevada and Arizona and Michigan and Pennsylvania are representative of everybody else, or we've delegated the decision to them formally? No, it's simply because they have roughly equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. That's just an irrational way to conduct a presidential election. How about it's time for us to elect the president the way we elect governors and mayors and representatives and senators and everybody else? Whoever gets the most votes wins, instead of this Byzantine, arcane, and obsolescent process, which these days can get you killed, as it almost did on January 6, 2021, as a strategic bad faith actor like Donald Trump, a corrupt would-be dictator and autocrat, attempted to use the joint session of Congress called for under the 12th Amendment and the Electoral College as an opportunity to try to upset the whole table and get his vice president simply to declare him president of the United States. Nearly got Mike Pence killed as they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence," and he had to flee the building. So we still have anti-democratic practices and mechanisms that are taking place. We are struggling to overcome those. And we are struggling to make sure that the constitutional processes that we've fought for in the past that exist are used to make us a more perfect union, which means a more democratic nation, right? We've admitted 37 states since the original 13, which means that nearly 3/4 of the states, 74% of the states, have been admitted since the original 13. Well, how about it's time for statehood for the people of Washington, D.C.? How about it's time for statehood for 3.5 million Americans living in Puerto Rico? We've got to get the engines of democratic expansion and change moving again. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that he observed that voting rights and democracy in our country were either shrinking and shriveling away or expanding. And we've got to get back on the growth path. So when we say we're defending democracy in America in this election, we are defending also the movement of democracy in America. It's an unfinished project. It's a process always in motion. So when someone says, we're not a democracy or a republic, what they're trying to tell you is they want to eliminate someone's voting rights. They want to prevent democracy in America. And this is a struggle that goes back to the beginning of the republic and that will continue into the future days of the strong democracy that we're becoming.
Now, I've got questions, of course, but first, just a quick note. We always try to use the opportunity for these classes to promote a good cause. So a public service announcement, if you will, to get your ballots in early. If you live in a state or a district where you have the opportunity to vote by mail or to vote in person early, do that early because the campaigns know whether you voted. They don't know who you voted for, but they know whether you voted. And so going in and voting early, submitting your mail ballot early, allows those campaigns to free up their resources for somebody who may actually be undecided, who may actually be on the fence as to whether they're going to cast their ballot at all. And so if you know you're going to vote, which I'm assuming most of the people watching this series do, then do yourself a favor, do the campaign a favor, and get your ballot in right away so that, again, they can use their limited resources, their money, their personnel, to focus their attention on the people that actually need that extra push. And Congressman, I know you wanted to say something about this as well.
Yeah, no, but I just want to echo that completely, Brian. I mean, we tell our people, and I would consider the people watching this to be our people because they are champions and activists of democracy, to vote early if your state permits it. vote by mail if you've made arrangements to do that and your state permits it, because then it frees you up on election day to go out and organize and get other people who may not have been as passionately engaged yet out to the polls and to make sure that they vote.
Now, getting to the questions here for posterity, so that we have a nice clippable moment from this in the event that somebody does echo the usual refrain, is a constitutional republic a form of democracy?
Yeah, it is. It's a representative democracy. Look, the Constitution says that Congress shall guarantee to the people of the states a Republican form of government. And I will hasten to say that doesn't mean a Republican Party form of government. That's the way Donald Trump would like people to think of it. But a Republican form of government, meaning a representative form of government. No kings and queens and dictators, no nobles. And we've talked about how we have an anti-monarchical constitution. We also have an anti-insurrectionary constitution. But we are a democratic republic, meaning we have rule of, by, and for the people. And the way that we, the people, exercise that power is through our representatives. Not everybody can go and be a president of the United States or a U.S. senator or a representative or even a school board member or a state legislator. We take turns doing it. Life has to go on, but we delegate to our leaders the responsibility of acting in the public interest as opposed to acting in their own private interest. So the same people who say, we're not a democracy, we're just a republic, they're the ones defending monarchs, would-be monarchs and kleptocrats like Donald Trump getting in. Donald Trump is not interested in using the government as an instrument for the public interest and the common good. He's interested in using the government as an opportunity for private self-enrichment, for private money-making. That's totally antithetical to the vision of our founders and what our entire history stands for. The government has got to be an instrument for advancing the well-being of all the people, not the private, selfish interests of the guy who gets in and his family.
Why do you believe at this time that MAGA Republicans are so desperate to convey this idea that we are expressly not a democracy?
Well, that's a great question, Brian. The reason they're so emphatic on this point is because they think that it will excuse every manner of electoral mischief and corruption. There's been a transformation, not just in the Constitution itself, but also in terms of constitutional jurisprudence, right? The Supreme Court, in a series of cases in the 1960s, articulated the doctrine of one person, one vote, right? Reynolds versus Sims said one person, one vote means there have to be equally apportioned state legislative districts. Westbury versus Sanders extended that principle to U.S. House districts, where we need to have almost mathematical exactitude in terms of the number of people in each district, on the theory that representatives represent people and not territory or factories or trees. People represent, representatives represent people, human beings. And so those cases were very strong in terms of deepening the meaning of democracy in America. Now, the right-wing Republicans who now represent a minority party and a shrinking minority party want to try to concoct any doctrines they can that will allow for dismissal of the popular vote and dilution of the popular vote. And that's why the right-wing Supreme Court has upheld gerrymandering. It's why they've been very loose about allowing states to impose voter suppression tactics. And it's why we get outrageous decisions like Bush versus Gore in 2000, when the Supreme Court actually intervened in the manual counting of ballots for the first time in American history to stop the counting of ballots in a presidential election, simply because they liked where the result was with George Bush ahead by 500 votes. So they overrode federalism, they overrode state law, they overrode the state constitution, and they overrode the principle of one person, one vote, just to freeze the frame and say George Bush is going to win. And so those who say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, are basically saying the Supreme Court does not have to implement democratic values of making sure that everybody can vote, every vote is counted, and the popular will is vindicated. Instead, we're going to allow particular judicial or administrative or political interventions in order to accomplish a particular result. And Brian, that's what I'm most afraid of in this election. When I'm out there campaigning, I'm seeing a huge popular majority forming for the Democratic ticket, the ticket of the democracy. But what I'm afraid of is that we will win the election and we have to defend the election, and they're going to try to find a way to make believe something else happened.
Does it strike you as antithetical to Republicans' own branding that so many of these self-proclaimed patriots, these Republicans, are so quick to outright dismiss the very concept of democracy? Or is that the inherent contradiction of their branding?
I think it is. You know, we have to put on two caps, okay? One cap is a partisan cap, all right? That we support our party and the political program it's advancing, if you've got one. I know we've got one on the Democratic side. I don't know what the program is on the other side other than to reinstall and re-enthrone Donald Trump.
Allegiance to the God King, yeah.
And that's one cap. That's our party cap. But then we have to put on the cap of constitutional patriotism, where we support our system of government. You know, and this is why, to me, Liz Cheney is such an important figure, because she's not removed her party cap. She still says she believes in everything she's always believed in, but she needs to put on the cap of the constitutional patriot right now, because Donald Trump and the MAGA party are such a threat to all of our constitutional values and all of our constitutional processes. They proved that on January 6th, 2021. They were willing to overthrow an election that Joe Biden had won by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, simply because they refused to think like constitutional patriots. They could only think about getting their party to win. That's why we're in such a dangerous situation right now.
And you had alluded to this before, but I want to dig into this just a quick moment here. To what extent does the anti-democratic nature of our system of government, be it the Electoral College, the inherent Republican advantage in the U.S. Senate, to what extent does that lend itself to Republicans' growing disdain for democracy?
Well, we still contain undemocratic features from the original Constitution. I think you've identified the two principal ones, the Electoral College, which is not strictly speaking organized along lines of democracy, and the U.S. Senate. On the other hand, as I've been trying to argue, the whole sweep of American political and constitutional history has been to become a greater and stronger democracy and to become a more perfect union by moving away from these anti-democratic filters towards real rule by the people. And that doesn't mean that that minorities and individuals are in danger. On the contrary, we are standing up equally strongly for individual freedom and individual rights. And that's why we need courts who are willing to defend the rights and the freedoms of the people, including voting rights of the people. What we have to fear is anti-democratic forms of government that are rivals to American constitutional democracy. That's what theocracy is, right? We've got the religious truth, say the theocrats, and we are going to organize society around a theocratic truth. That's what the Christian white nationalists want to do in Project 2025. They want to organize society around the rule of church leaders and church elders and theocrats who will propound theological truths that everybody's got to accept. Now, of course, that collides directly, as we've discussed in this series, with the Establishment Clause, with the Free Exercise Clause, with the clause that says there shall be no religious tests for public office. But that's a rival to democracy, right? Theocracy. Another one is kleptocracy, that the government belongs to the guy who can get in and steal as much as possible. That's a Trumpian form of government. He has run roughshod over the Foreign Government Emoluments Clause, as we've discussed, and the Domestic Government Emoluments Clause. The role of the president is to seek the public good and to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And what that meant, the founders told us, is the guy who gets in or the woman who gets in cannot be collecting presents, emoluments, meaning payments, offices or titles of any kind whatever from foreign states and kings and princes. And yet that's exactly what Donald Trump did when he was in office. He pocketed millions and millions of dollars from foreign states like China and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Indonesia and so on. And also, the president is limited to his salary in office. That's what the Domestic Emoluments Clause says. The president gets his or her salary and cannot take any other money. And yet, when Trump was in, again, millions of dollars directed from the U.S. government to the Trump hotels and golf courses through the Secret Service, through the White House, through the Commerce Department. And the Democrats in the House Oversight Committee are about to release a report detailing the receipts we've been able to get. And of course, Chairman Comer, in his wisdom, has been doing everything he can to obstruct our access to that information under the Mazars case. Well, look, that was the whole vision of the framers, that you wouldn't put in a monarch or a kleptocrat, a plutocrat. You put in somebody who's going to serve the public interest. So there have been a lot of rivals to democracy. I concede that cheerfully, that there have been people who've wanted a theocracy, who've wanted plutocracy, who've wanted an autocracy, who want dictatorship. Donald Trump says he will be a dictator on day one. He's not hiding that. And we're not hiding the fact that we're standing up for constitutional democracy against his agenda.
Perfectly put. And just to underscore, if there's ever been a more vocal champion for democracy, Congressman, it's you here. So with that said, what can we look out for in the next episode of Class?
Well, hey, Brian, first of all, thank you for your kind words. There, of course, have been far greater champions of democracy and democratic freedom than me in our history, beginning with the great Tom Paine and Ben Franklin and Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. We've had great champions of democracy. We've got to keep the spirit of democracy and democratic freedom alive in the country and resist all of the propaganda and dogma about how we're not democracy. Abraham Lincoln talked about how we're a democracy. The Supreme Court has talked about the democratic features in our life, but the people centrally and our movements have struggled to create a more perfect union, which means to make us a deeper and stronger democracy than we've ever been. What we're going to look at next time is another interesting fight we're having, and a fallacy at the center of it. And the fallacy is that Congress cannot delegate power to administrative agencies to implement the legislative mandates of Congress. And we're going to look at this new attempt to disable the agencies and a concomitant fallacy that the Supreme Court should be able to yank back all of the policy choices that Congress has committed to the executive branch for the Supreme Court to decide in its reactionary, MAGA, neo-monarchical wisdom today.
And of course, we're in the midst of watching that take place right now. So to watch that episode as soon as it's out, please make sure to subscribe to this channel. The link to subscribe is right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Jamie Raskin. And everybody, I don't know if we're going to meet again before the election. Stand strong for democracy and freedom in America. Hang tough, everybody.
And this is Class with Jamie Raskin.